Hello everyone, this is Parvinder Chahal again. Thank you for joining. Today's webinar from AWS Activate series is co-presented with one of our most exciting customers, Spool, essentially the actual place to go for Indian consumers to access premium video content. I have the pleasure of introducing Michael Smith, who's actually the Chief Production Officer for Spool, who's actually going to be talking you through their experiences in the second half of this presentation. I plan to speak for about 45 minutes, but just before I get into the actual presentation, just a little bit of housekeeping. We'd ask all of our attendees today to please fill out the actual survey at the end of the session. And also, we very much value your feedback and any questions or opinions, so we will be having a question and answer session at the end of this session today. So without further ado, I'll kick off on the actual presentation. So the actual webinar today, as I mentioned, is focusing on improving our customer experience and helping our startup community grow an addressable market space, and trying to focus on how the AWS platform and indeed the CloudFront service, which is a content delivery network, can help you achieve those goals. Obviously, this is a journey which is takes a long and winding path, as the actual image shows you there. We have a lot of experience working with the startup community. AWS itself has grown dramatically over the last couple of years, and a large majority of our customers started off in this space, and it's a market that we very much value, and we understand some of the pressures that you have to walk through. In essence, it all boils down to building a service which comes from an idea and creating a minimal viable product, allowing this to scale and actually ensuring this is done in a profitable fashion. And what we wanted to do is just walk through some of the challenges that we see and we hear from our customers, and how we can potentially help you hurdle those challenges and succeed in your goals. Often our customers talk to us about their initial product, and some of the challenges they face are pretty obvious. How can we ship this service out to customers? How can we develop and iterate our service faster? How can we do this better? And how can we make this cheaper? All that leads towards is trying to improve a customer experience. It's not tech for tech's sake. It's how does an end user going to consume this service and get a better experience to make it stickier and make it more valuable for them. Obviously, all these things need to actually drive revenue and success through actually earning money, and therefore you need to try and understand is how do individuals buy this service? What would they actually pay for it? What are the comparable options they have in the marketplace, and why is the way you're doing it going to be more useful? To do that, you need to be able to scale, and you also need to be able to deal with unpredictable spikes. Depending on the nature of your traffic, it may change through seasonality or through specific titles that you bring to the market, which suddenly give you a surge of demand, and you must be able to actually deliver that, or your reputation will suffer. And all that boils down to is the ability to make sure that you can reach as many customers as you can with a consistent level of performance. And finally, on this initial piece of the journey, how do you actually do that in a profitable way? How do you actually make money from this? How do you break even in the short term? And also, how do you make sure that your cost of actual delivery continues to reduce as you grow? And that's something we can walk you through in today's webinar. We wanted to give you an example of examples from around the world, and obviously many of you out there will have heard of the book The Lean Startup, authored by a gentleman called Eric Rice. And there's a quotation from him which I think is quite relevant to this, is that he views the cloud very much like a fertilizer that helps create startups, or perhaps enables them is a better way of describing it. And one example we wanted to use today is a company called Flipboard. I'm sure many of you have heard of this organization, but if you haven't, it's essentially a personalized magazine. And I think it's a good example because primarily what you're doing is continue creating and personalizing an experience. So you look at content that's interesting to you, and your engagement via multiple devices, be it mobile or a tablet or indeed a laptop, is actually specialized and personalized based on that, and you can continually engage with it to make it more and more personal for you. And that makes it more interesting, and therefore you spend more time doing it, which is obviously better for Flipboard as an organization. And this entire infrastructure has been built up on our platform, and they obviously use CloudFront to deliver that experience to their end users. A very, very high-level schematic here on this next slide shows you how Flipboard have architected in a multi-tier architectural diagram. They're using CloudFront to actually deliver both static and dynamic content, using Amazon S3, which is our simple storage service for their origin store for static content, and they have an ELB and multiple layers of tiered architecture from their interactive servers, their data stores using RDS, HBase and the Memcache, and also down towards the queuing services which lean out towards things like social networking and RSS feeds. Very, very high level, of course, and we're going to dive deeper in terms of technology later in this presentation, but they've used this architecture to scale up to actually access over 7 million personalized magazines globally, which is a huge amount of growth in a very short space of time. One of the mechanisms I wanted to highlight here and dive deeper into a little bit further in this webinar is that whilst we've actually enabled lots of customers to achieve scale in terms of their technology and processes, we've also managed to work with them to create specific commercial models that help them drive down their costs. And this diagram walks through how Flipboard actually used one of our billing mechanisms, which is called a reserved instance. So on the vertical axis, you have the cost. Here, this particular metric is cents. And on the horizontal axis is time, so between June 2010 and February 2014. So the white line that you can see is essentially the cost per monthly active user. And this is how many of you have to try and think about your costs. You know, as you increase the number of users you have, how does the actual cost relate? And hopefully that's being driven down. And as you can see from the white line here, it's constantly been driving down to February 2014. And the actual blue rectangles highlight that actually that managed to increase the number of users over that time. And that's kind of the pattern that is an ideal scenario for all organizations. And we'll talk you through how we can achieve that. Some of the startups that we've worked with alongside Spool are here across the world, and I'll focus on the Asia Pacific examples. So 9gag, for example, a social networking site from Hong Kong. In the bottom left-hand corner of my screen, you can see the logo for Xiaomi, the mobile handset manufacturer, which is experiencing huge growth. Bottom right-hand corner, Shihu 360, which is an antivirus company from China. All these organizations have actually utilized the AWS platform, but specifically CloudFront, to ensure that their actual user experience is of an optimal level. They're all very different organizations, whether it's social networking, software downloads, or firmware downloads in the case of some of them, but they all need the same things: consistent performance and low cost to make sure they can increase their addressable market globally. So back to the actual agenda today. A couple of things we wanted to highlight, 4 key points. The first one is that your customer behavior is changing and their expectations are actually evolving. The second point is to try and highlight how CloudFront can help you. Why do you even need a CDN? And we'll try and target 3 specific areas: how we improve your customer experience, how we grow your addressable market, and how we minimize your costs. Obviously, then we're going to dive deeper into the customer case study with Smithy at Spool, and then we're going to give you an idea of how we can take all this information and these experiences and allow you to get started using our platform. So let's kick off in terms of your customers. This particular diagram here just shows essentially what we're trying to highlight, and that is that your reputation is driven by your performance. There's loads of metrics out there about the importance of latency and availability in terms of your web presence, for want of a better expression. But this one I think articulates it quite well. You can see 4 circles in front of you. On the left-hand side, it highlights how a 1-second delay in page time translates to an effect of conversions, page views, and customer satisfaction. And here you can see a 1-second delay reduces your conversions by 7%, 11% reduction in page views, and that results in a 16% decrease in customer satisfaction. But what does that actually mean in terms of money? How does that affect what you're doing in terms of your earnings? So this particular example, a customer who's earning $100,000 a day from their end users, having this 1-second delay actually translates to them losing about $2.5 million in sales. And this is a quotation from a company called StrangeLoop. Now you could argue that metric is quite large in terms of your earnings per day, but the percentages still stand. You know, if you're earning $1,000 a day, it's still going to affect it quite dramatically. And often you find reputation is something very hard to rebuild, so it's important we get it right first time. I always try and think about the user though. You know, how do your end customers actually engage with you, and what are they trying to do? Very basic examples here highlight some of the different challenges you face, both technically and commercially. So the first one could be traveling. I myself was recently traveling to the States, and I spent a lot of time looking up different travel options, essentially looking up logistics and things like the weather, for example. Also news, that, you know, current affairs, sports, things like e-commerce when you're essentially buying things online, and obviously security becomes a key issue there. But also consuming premium media, things like video, games, and applications where the user experience have different stresses, and you need to be able to architect correctly for that. And then finally banking, paying for all the things above, and again security and consistency is hugely important. They're all slightly different in terms of use cases, but they all need the same things, which is a fast, consistent performance regardless of what platform or device you're accessing by, or indeed the part of the world that you're doing it in, and it needs to be personalized to your end user, just in terms of them as an individual, but also in terms of it being secure, something they feel safe actually carrying out and continuing to actually use. So how will CloudFront help you address some of these challenges and take you through this journey to engage with your customers in a manner that addresses all of these points? Well, just to make sure we're level set, I'm sure most of our viewers today understand what a CDN is, but just wanted to underline what we're talking about here. On this diagram, pretty straightforward. An end user is trying to access content, in this case via their laptop. And when they're using a CDN like CloudFront, their actual request is routed to the nearest location by latency. That's a key point to highlight. It's not necessarily just the physical location. CloudFront will automatically look up the best location to serve that content based on speed to make sure they get a good end user experience. It will also then check whether or not this point of presence or edge location has a copy of that content. And if it doesn't, it will go back to the origin. In this case, we're using an Amazon S3 bucket, or indeed it could be your own on-premise origin. And then what it does is take that request back, copy it, place that into the edge, and then serve the content back to the end user. The second instance would be an individual, or perhaps the same individual, trying to access the same content. And in this example, instead of going all the way back to the origin, the content is served from the edge location. And you can specify exactly how long that content is kept to the edge. So for example, in a dynamic situation, which I'll go into a bit further, you may wish every request to go all the way back to the origin to make sure it's personalized or based on its device. But if it's a static object, then having it served from the edge location and storing it there for an appropriate amount of time helps improve the user experience, but also can drive down your costs. In this example, you don't have to actually scale up your origin capacity because your edge location is taking that load, and we'll dive into that a little bit further as we go along. But just to summarize, what is a CDN actually going to provide you? Some of the core things here are reducing the latency or the time it takes to deliver something to your end user, also ensuring it's highly available, just as important. There's no point having a CDN that's fast if it's not available, because it defeats the purpose of actually adding that in terms of your infrastructure. It can give you high bandwidth. And a simple example of this is it allows you to have the highest quality from day one. So from a video sort of workload perspective, you can look at serving things like HD to your end users and utilize technology like HLS, for example, which allows adaptive bit rates to personalize and fine-tune the experience depending on where your user is and their current capacity. It also is highly redundant, and again, what that really leans towards is availability and ensuring that your brand is not disrupted by any single points of failure in terms of internet traffic. And it also allows you to go global very, very quickly. You're not actually limited in terms of where you can serve content now. So you sign up with CloudFront and you can access, or rather deliver content to users anywhere in the world straight away, allowing you to test and actually look at your minimal viable product and ensure it's right for each individual market. And finally, and potentially most importantly, it's extremely cost effective. We're very transparent about our costs. You can see all of them on our website. And there is a pay-as-you-go model, which means you basically pay for what you're using. But if you choose to, once you're at a point of maturity where you understand that how much traffic you're consuming, we can also build private pricing for you. And I'll go into that a little bit later. All this sounds great, but if it's not easy to actually do and it disrupts your current workflow, then obviously it defeats the purpose. So we've been very conscious to make sure that working with AWS and Amazon CloudFront specifically is very straightforward. So you can access and kind of work with our systems using a variety of different tools depending on your preference. So there are API options, command line options, and indeed using the console where through a few clicks you can actually have the service set up in minutes. We're trying to make sure that we don't disrupt your workflow, keep it simple, and make sure you're not having to re-architect a service that you spend a lot of time building already. How does this actually improve your customer experience? I'm going to give you a very basic example here. And we're not saying for 1 second that our customers and our startup community aren't well designed. A lot of them already have a very strong existing infrastructure. And this example is a pretty good way of articulating that. So here you have Route 53, which is our managed DNS server on the bottom service on the bottom left-hand corner, and a customer that's architected well. They've got multiple availability zones, so we're utilizing a way of making sure they're highly redundant and highly available. Within those, they have an elastic load balancer balancing between both availability zones, EC2 servers acting as their web servers, and behind that they have an RDS database layer. So you've got a well-designed two-tier architecture As I mentioned, it's highly available. You've got load balancing in place. You have auto-scaling, which essentially allows you to increase and decrease your server capacity based on requests and demands, and a fully managed database included. So that's a pretty good start. But what you're really saying here is you're wasting server capacity for static content. It's the durability of the content isn't optimal because you're using potentially a server, not an origin store. And also the end user experience could be improved because a lot of these requests that you're actually getting from customers could be offloaded and cached using a content delivery network. And that improves the actual customer experience, but it also affects your costing, which I'll come on to in a second. So as you can see here, if you add on the top left-hand corner, if you add CloudFront and S3, what you're doing there is increasing your durability and improving your user experience. So now you have multiple options in terms of engaging with your end customer. Just to make sure that the language that I'm using is the same as the audience, when I'm saying static content, what am I actually meaning here? Static content essentially are objects on your website that don't change from user to user. So a good example might be your company logo, or images on your actual website, or indeed the actual structure of the site itself using CSS or JavaScript files. But you also have dynamic content. This is essentially interactive or personalized, the personalized portion of your website created on the fly. I mentioned some of the examples earlier, news, weather, sports, but it also includes things like social media and advertising. So these things basically are personalized for the end user itself, but also potentially for the device you're actually accessing the content for. Let me give you an example. I always find it a little bit easier if you look at a specific use case. And here's the Amazon.com website. I'm sure you're all very familiar with that. If you break this actual web page down, you can see multiple different areas. Bottom left-hand corner is a static image. You know, it's a picture of a particular product we're trying to advertise to a consumer. And the bottom right-hand corner provides you a richer experience where you've got a video, where you potentially have a product demonstration of what the actual service looks like. But if you break it further down, if you can notice here that one of the dynamic elements is it's personalized. So this individual's logged in and they're presented with their name and some of their preferences. So automatically you're starting to engage on a more personal level with your customer. And then you add an option for user input. And this may be where perhaps you type in a search. In this case it could be a product or it could be a video. It could be a variety of aspects. But this is an element, again, which is more dynamic and it's created specifically based on the customer input. So to support these actual elements of the web page, you can break it down. So the static elements and the video pieces can be delivered obviously directly off something like S3. When you start looking at the dynamic and element and also the user input, you're looking at dynamic content which is served directly back to the origin to make sure it's personalized to the user. But you also need to accelerate the actual input of data into this particular site. So using things like post and put, where someone can actually have the actual session they have with the website accelerated. So the key point here is you're accelerating the entire experience. And finally, obviously, a key issue for lots of people today is security. It also needs to be delivered over a secure environment, especially if you're handing in personal details or indeed credit card information. And Amazon CloudFront can handle all of these use cases and accelerate them all so you have a safe, secure, and highly personalized experience for your customers. Typically, when you're supporting this infrastructure, you may have dynamic content going back to your origin itself, which is the top right-hand side of the slide, and the bottom right-hand side will be the static content. And most people think you just use the CDN for that particular piece, or indeed you have to split your architecture out. The beauty of this service is that you can actually deliver both sets of content through the same service and actually not have to pay a premium for the fact that you're actually doing that. Therefore, it's very cost-effective, simplifies your architecture, and you're getting a great personalized experience for your customers. I talked about a minimal viable product earlier, and what I wanted to stress here is that we're going through the same evolution ourselves. CloudFront's only been going for a certain number of years, and we've had to continually iterate based on our customers' demand. And this graph is only covering about 12 months of time, and as you can see, there's a huge amount of changes in this service. We're adding features specifically based on what our customers have asked for. What we tend to say to a customer is if there's something that you're looking for in our service, let us understand why you need it, test the service out, and if we need to add features or indeed locations, we will do that. And again, I can give you some more data points around that later on. So that helps you improve the customer experience using things like detection of the device, their location, the actual protocol they're serving across, personalizing it and making it secure. But how do you then actually use all those individual features to grow your addressable market? Well, the first thing is it's very, very simple to actually start with. You can do this whilst I'm actually talking to you today. Literally sign up in 15 minutes. but there's no CapEx sort of barriers to actually start this service. There's no setup fees, no platform fees, no specific customer code, and no re-architecting of your service to get started. And we also have a free tier, so I'll give you some details about that later on. But what that means is you can start to test the service and get used to it. And obviously, if you require any more help, there's some support options which we can detail a little bit later on. But going global obviously is that. It's a physical reach out into the market space. And as you can see here, Amazon CloudFront currently has 52 points of presence globally. Now, what do we mean by a point of presence? Way back, I think, when most CDNs out there were actually building their infrastructure, I think internet connectivity had a lot more issues. And essentially what most CDNs did was build smaller servers and place them pretty much in every ISP globally. But with the advent of internet exchange points and better connectivity, what made more sense was actually building much larger capacity in those internet exchange points to improve your caching capability and actually improve the end user experience. That's what we've done in terms of our infrastructure rollout. To give you an idea of how much an idea of growth for the last, we've actually released 12 points of presence in the last 12 months, and we continue to do so. So again, if there are areas of coverage that you require, please tell us about it. I very much encourage you to test the service as is, and then we can pinpoint why you would need an additional area of coverage and where that would be, and we can feed that back to our product managers because we are continually adding to this coverage as we speak. Growth is always a good thing, but sometimes it's hugely unexpected, and often you essentially experience what you call death by success. You can suddenly have a massive amount of growth in a short space of time, and if you haven't been able to provision for that, you essentially get a situation where you get lots of very unhappy customers and your reputation is damaged. But also planning for that financially is difficult. Do you plan for the worst case scenario and pay for that? Or do you work with an organization that can allow you to peak very, very quickly and then also drop down when you don't need it? And this is a very simple example of a video ad banner that went viral for one of our customers. And you can see from the vertical axis you've got volume of data delivered. This specific example is bandwidth. And the horizontal axis is the amount of time. And the key point here is this customer experienced 60 gigabits per second of bandwidth requirement in the space of an hour, and then was able to scale right back down again and purely paid for what they use. And because it was a video banner, they monetized that amount of time, and therefore it was still a profitable situation and it didn't destroy their actual infrastructure. So a good example of how we can help you deal with a very unexpected workload, given that you're actually iterating on a mobile product. Another thing to point out really here is that whilst we have customers of different scales in terms of their size, we don't treat them any differently. So you have the access to all the support options, whether you're a one-person startup or a large enterprise. So you're obviously all enabled to self-service, but you also get access to our AWS solution architects, something which I stress, that these guys are extremely talented. They will come in to actually meet you, whiteboard your current architecture, walk through your plans and help you plan individual steps to get you to where you want to be and provide you options that actually save you money. But they're also backed up by a 24-hour AWS customer service. We'll also have direct lines into our product team should they be required. But one thing to stress here is this isn't just a customer support line. These are dedicated support engineers. They actually understand the service and can provide you really useful feedback straight away. Some of our customers also expect a really high level of support or more dedicated support. We have other options as well, which give you response times below 15 minutes. And if anyone's interested in that, again, please do reach out to us on the Q&A or sending questions into us as mentioned beforehand. And finally, what I wanted to point out here from the sort of three tenets we were talking about is how does this all translate to driving your costs down? That's what it boils down to, right? It's all about making sure that you scale, but you're actually not burning cash and actually making sure you're focusing your resources on features that are actually going to drive revenue for them. And that's what we want to try and help you with CloudFront. I'll get back to the example I mentioned before. As mentioned, it was a pretty solid infrastructure setup, had multiple tiers, but it had no origin store, no CDN or CloudFront, which is entitled CF here, but it was relying on up to 6 EC2 instances, our compute instances, essentially because they were scaling up and scaling down using auto-scaling to manage the actual volume of requests that were coming in. So it was working, but it wasn't optimal. So what we start to do is add different layers into it. So again, we mentioned we actually added in S3 for the origin store, and then actually added CloudFront in front of that. But you still actually had 6 EC2 instances. But what you find over time is by adding these multiple layers, the requirement to have ever-increasing origin infrastructure to manage a request dramatically reduces. And that's because the content delivery network, CloudFront, is actually taking that load away from you. It's obviously priced aggressively to make sure we reduce that cost, but it also means you don't have to keep spending money on your origin infrastructure, and you can focus that resource in other aspects of your actual business. To give you an example of how that looked at, we're just going to give you some a breakdown of some examples we saw from specific customers. And I'll caveat this by saying it's a specific set of price points we use, and obviously we would work with your own infrastructure to understand how this model may translate to you, but I think it's good as an illustration. So we went from the standard architecture we originally talked about to this more optimized architecture which included CloudFront. And we did a load test based on 10,000 requests on both sets of infrastructure. So what do you think happened? What we found was the standard infrastructure essentially worked out to a cost of $679 a month. And that included both EC2 and also data transfer out from the origin. And data transfer from the origin is very different to CDN data transfer. It's priced differently and obviously doesn't have the layers of control and personalization that you have. So it's a key point remembering when you look at why a CDN is going to be useful for it. We're not talking about ISP bandwidth here. This is much more complex. You look at the optimized architecture, and as you can see, the number of EC2 servers is reduced. The data transfer cost going out from CloudFront is obviously lower than what you'd have from the origin. And as you'll see, the cost is broken down in terms of the volume of data transfer, but also the number of requests. And the reason we do that is we have so many different types of customers. We've broken down our cost to sort of suit that mix. Some of our clients don't have a large volume of data transfer, but have lots of Spool files, and their overhead really is the number of requests. So we try and split those costs down to make it nice and simple for them. But the key point here is, as you can see, this relates to a 57% lower cost for this company, and actually it was 6 times faster in terms of the actual performance. I generally think if you can reduce your costs by that much and be faster, it's generally a good thing. But in terms of cost, one thing we do try and highlight is it's not just what you're paying out, it's the time and the resources that you are using to manage this infrastructure. As I said before, and I can't stress this enough, your team should be focusing on building out the service, not managing the infrastructure like this. And often people don't necessarily try and analyze how much that works to in terms of cost, whether it be individuals' time or how slow it is to take you to get out to the actual marketplace. All of these things factor in, come into the actual play when you're looking at the cost of actually making your options. And hopefully we can help walk through that with you. The last point I wanted to touch upon in terms of cost was, as I mentioned beforehand, you look at our pricing on our website, that's reflected in this particular diagram. Again, the vertical axis is a price per GB, so it's data transfer here now in terms of the actual way the metric we're using to measure traffic. The blue line is essentially the cost per GB and how it reduces over time in terms of volume. You pretty much expect that, right? The more that you actually serve, the lower the cost. But the key thing here is that we actually also offer private rates, which is the red line. And what that does is dramatically reduce your cost straight away. And one thing I think what I wanted to highlight here was you don't have to be a huge organization to get this. It doesn't have to be a multiple petabyte company in terms of monthly data transfer. I had hundreds of customers out there who actually just chosen to use CloudFront and commit to using CloudFront on an exclusive only basis. What that basically means is they don't actually have a volume commit. They just choose to use CloudFront as their only CDN. And again, they only pay for what they use, but we dramatically reduce their costs, sometimes up to 40 or 50%. So again, don't worry about necessarily the size of your consumption. Do reach out to us. We'll work with you to understand your traffic profile and what we are trying to take your business, and try and build a private price card for you to help you take along that journey. But to give you a little bit more detail about what that's really like in terms of a customer experience, I'm now going to take the opportunity to pass the actual presentation over to Michael. Michael, over to you.
Okay, everybody. Nice to virtually audio meet you. This is Michael, and I'm the Chief Product Officer at Spool. And I'm going to do my best here kind of walking through some of the things that we do and some of the technology we use. I'm also available on Twitter at Dreampipe, D-R-E-A-M-P-I-P-E. So if anybody wants to contact me or tweet a question or say hello, I'm happy to follow back. All right, so a little bit about Spool. Spool is a global OTT service, video service. OTT means over the top, so we just use the internet, and we focus on premium Indian movie and TV content for Indian consumers globally. And we do this out of Singapore. We love the startup scene in Singapore, and it's awesome that Amazon is here and has such a great support infrastructure for startups. So we were founded in 2011, and we launched our website in 2012. And we have a very large kind of movie and TV catalog for streaming on the web. We have an iOS app, an Android app. We have some smart TV apps. We have set-top box apps. We support Chromecast. We have lots of partners also using our streams and data and players to create Indian movie experiences on other sites as well. Everything's running on AWS, and a lot of times the questions are, what did we do before AWS, or how did we move to AWS? We actually started from day one on AWS, and that was kind of a decision based on, one, knowing that we wanted to be global, and two, knowing that we had a very small team and needed, the auspices of a very large infrastructure to kind of work with to launch what we did. So we've been using AWS since day one, and I would say we're pretty big users of it. I'll talk to this slide a little bit. I'm not going to go into every part of it, but just to give you a sense of kind of what we do, and if we have clients, which are obviously, everything from the apps to the website, talking to Route 53 to kind of manage our DNS and things like geographic failover, and those things, talk to CloudFront to get the movies. So we actually do all our movie streaming with CloudFront. I think we're one of the few people that kind of do the entire streaming stack with CloudFront, and we also support like things with our graphical assets and things like that also come from CloudFront. We do all of our video with HLS. Try not to get too technical on the video side, but essentially that is a segmented file delivery that looks like a movie, and this allows you to do things like caching and streaming with products like CloudFront. You don't have to do what typically people think of streaming as flash streaming. So we're big users of CloudFront and do all of our video with it, and I think we have a lot of experience with it and very happy with what we can do with it around the globe. Around that, we are big users of S3, so all of our storage is S3, which, if you're using S3, it's very easy to then use CloudFront, and that's one of the nice things about it. So all of our movies kind of live in S3, both the originals we get, the encoded files that we make from them. So it makes it very easy for us to kind of write code around these objects, deal with them, and then boom, suddenly stream them. And we can automate all that stuff. It's a great kind of linkage, having the storage and the streaming capability all kind of tied into one. We use a lot of EC2 machines, both for everything that programmatically we do, from the API that runs the system to background jobs to just places for us to write code and do automation is all running there. We're big users of Elasticache, so we've done a lot of work to kind of cache assets and do a lot of server-side caching to kind of increase the API performance. And recently, with a lot of this running, I don't think Amazon's happy about this, we've been able to cut our machines in half by using a lot more sophisticated caching techniques, which has been good for us. So everything is automated, right? So we run a few machines constantly, and then as things get busy, they auto-scale, and then they'll cut back down when we don't need them anymore. So we use a lot of Elasticache to help with that. We use RDS for our main database. We ask to use Elasticsearch for all of our searching. So when you're looking for a movie and any of our apps and you're typing something into the search box, you're actually using Elasticsearch for that. And then we also use a lot of databases. So apart from just RDS, we use the DynamoDB, where we do a lot of write-only type high-performance things for tracking and for stream analyzation, all kind of get pushed in the DynamoDB. And then we use EMR to crunch these things. And a big thing we've been doing over the last, I would say 3 to 6 months, I think we were introduced to Redshift probably a year ago maybe. And obviously we thought it was very interesting. It was like this idea that we could kind of move towards a data warehouse-like infrastructure, but we didn't think we could really afford it per se, both from a cost and from the time and effort to kind of get things into it. But recently, as our team grew, we got someone who's quite adept at EMR and kind of the data warehouse techniques, and we realized that the vision really should be to try to get all of our data that we do analyzations and crunching on into Redshift. And that means we have data kind of laying around in Dynamo, we had data in RDS, we had data in flat files, we had spreadsheets on S3. And what we've done is everything now is getting crunched and automated and pushed into Redshift. I think we have about 30 gigabit in Redshift at this point. And then we use another kind of thing we got in the Amazon Marketplace. This is the other great thing about Amazon is you can kind of roll around in the marketplace and find products that are easier than maybe writing your own code. And we use Jaspersoft to create a reporting infrastructure around Redshift. So now all of our dashboards and all of our ad hoc reporting and everything that accounting uses comes from a centralization. And I know from talking to our content managers that are accounting people is that they're now saving hours per day in dealing with data, knowing that all the data is in Redshift and that all the reporting is kind of done for them. So this Redshift thing wasn't there for us like 6 months ago, but now it's a big pivotal piece of our strategy. I think we add about 1.5 gigs of data to Redshift every month. So this whole box you see, this white box, I kind of call this, Netflix for India in a box, all running on AWS. And I think this is an amazing thing that we've accomplished with a very small tech team, about 6-7 people, and all the Amazon kind of code and expertise has allowed us to do this. So there's a lot that I could talk about here, but I'll leave you with that snapshot and kind of dive in on some other stuff. So what Spool has to do, I mean, the things that keep me up at night, if you want to think of it this way from a very raw technical thing we have to do, is obviously we have an API that runs 24/7 that powers all the Spool apps and all of our partner apps, and it just can't go down. And what, there are times that it goes down and have problems, but we have like geographic failover and we have a lot of stuff in there to try to recover, but it has to stay running because if it doesn't run, people can't watch a movie. We want to stream video consistently around the globe, and that's something we've, it's taken a lot of sweat equity, so to speak, to really learn how to do this because we have a lot of customers in the emerging markets like India, Pakistan, Middle East, and having to understand all the networks and how things work. Sometimes doing video streaming at scale, at quality with these type of homegrown stuff coupled with CloudFront requires that there's a lot of things we got to deal with. Like as soon as we launch a new movie, how do we get out there quickly so that the caching servers are all in sync? How do we troubleshoot things when they're not working? So these things we kind of have to stay on top of. We store a lot of user data and a lot of what we call stream information. So these are when people are watching a movie. We know that so-and-so watched a movie from their iOS app in Dubai at this time. And we keep all this stuff so that we can create really good analytics around what we do, and it helps us with our movie buying and helps us with understanding users. So we store a lot of data and we create a lot of data every day, and essentially everything's either flowing through Dynamo, RDS, or S3, and then into Redshift once we process it. We auto-scale as needed, so we have a certain amount of machines running consistently, and then those machines will double or triple at times depending on the load. And the other thing we've been able to do is automate what we call pre-scaling. So one of the things we know is if we are getting ready to launch a new movie and we're going to do a bunch of in-app notifications to our iOS and our Android people, we're going to send a bunch of email that as soon as people click on those things, one, the API servers are going to get busy, and if they start streaming these things, the streaming servers are going to get busy, right? So we actually now do both auto-scaling, and then we've written a lot of code around what we call pre-scaling. So when we get ready to launch something, we go ahead and pre-scale and get ready, because what we don't want people to do is have a slow API response because we're pushing stuff and we're scaling all at the same time. So what we try to do is smooth that bump out by pre-scaling. And I think our model is always to code if we can, right? We know there's things that we can buy off the shelf that maybe do some of these features, but it might have a licensing fee or a monthly fee or a support fee. And we do have things that we have to buy, but generally we try to say, hey, what can we use out of the Amazon stack coupled with some code and some ingenuity to build a similar feature that over the long haul will save us money and should be more valuable to the valuation of the company, because these are the innovations that we create. So kind of some key AWS tech. I think I covered this in the white slide, but I'll just run through some of the main things we do. We do a lot of EC2. We do some reserved instances. We do some spot stuff. We do a little bit of everything depending on what's happening with the business. And we're very happy with being able to just kind of grab a machine anywhere around the world that we need it to do something, and maybe it's only for a short period of time. All of our main stuff is being written to RDS. A lot of our analytics and things are being written to Dynamo, and then everything that gets crunched gets put into Redshift so that we have a nice way of doing analyzations and a nice way of centralizing kind of the data storehouse. We started to use the Elasticache stuff a lot, which is essentially an Amazon service of Redis, and a lot of tuning and tweaking to that, but we're very happy with what we can do with it. Big users of S3. I think we're terabytes and terabytes of everything from source movies to encoded movies, and we use these different buckets around the world depending on where we need something. That's the other nice thing, is we can process things where we need it and kind of ingest them where we need it, because Amazon's distributed everywhere. CloudFront for all of our assets and streaming. There's a lot of things you can do with all this plumbing when it's running together. I think one of the things that we find very interesting is we can build our own little enhancements to things. Some of these things, actually come up to be features later with Amazon, or get added to CloudFront. But we can kind of go ahead and keep innovating around this stack and just rent time on machines to build interesting features. So we've done things like some pre-caching techniques. We've done some cache-ahead techniques, and enhance what CloudFront does, but allows us to kind of do it with the way we want to manage something. So there's a lot of things you can do when you kind of have all this running together, and I think the sky's the limit really on wiring these things together and doing interesting things with them. We're also, we're excited that we know Amazon's always working on new and interesting things, and we're keeping a kind of a firm eye on Kinesis, which is a kind of in-the-cloud tracking mechanism, and we actually think this will probably eventually kill our need for Dynamo, and we'll move this into kind of a cloud-based logging where, as everybody's using the service, they're actually writing the analytic information to Kinesis, and then we can just crunch that stuff and stick it into Redshift. So we might be cutting one product for another, but it's because it's an evolution, right? It's a new thing, and it's a different way of doing something. So rather than routing something through our APIs to then write to Dynamo, we could write directly to Kinesis from the client. So we're keeping an eye on Kinesis. It's not released yet in this region, but we played with it, I think, in America for a bit. So I think the cool thing about Amazon is, they're doing things that need them to constantly innovate for their Amazon core business, and I think that's how a lot of stuff drops out and falls into being an Amazon web service, and we're pretty stoked about that. So I'll kind of get into my why AWS speech, where sometimes a lot of people kind of fall off their chair when they read a few of these things. But and the first thing I'll say is we love the Amazon sales reps. But what's great about Amazon is you don't need them to run your business, and I say that in all honesty and also as a confidence thing, meaning this is a good thing. It's not a negative thing. A lot of times the services are hidden behind sales reps and documents and things you got to sign and commitments. And you can't just use something and figure out, is it valuable to you, and then later go and hammer out a deal. So yes, the sales reps do call us and they drop by and say hi to us, but we don't need them to get things done, and that's actually a very great benefit to Amazon. We can automate everything, right? Amazon is there with the tools that they build, or lots of, it's amazing how many tools Netflix builds and puts into open source, but we can figure out ways to kind of automate everything, and it really means that you can have one person managing a very large system with the level of automation you can achieve. We can play with machines all around the world, so we can look at different hotspots and say, hey, if we came up with this feature here, it might help this particular partnership here. Great, we just go grab some time on an EC2 machine in a particular region, hammer out a solution, figure out if it works. Then what we can do is say, hey, let's scale this up around a lot of servers. We'll analyze all the data over a couple weeks, and we'll decide, is this a new feature? Is this a new product? Should we ship it? But we can do all this very quickly and at scale, and then really decide how to ship something. So the other thing we find is that normally, depending on how things work, a little bit of code and some ingenuity and some AWS prowess generally allows us to build a service cheaper than that service elsewhere, right? Meaning I could go somewhere and I could buy push, or I could go somewhere and I could buy a certain cache mechanism. There's lots of things, or I could buy an analytics service. And I'm not saying you shouldn't do that, but what we found is if we can kind of wire something together with code and the infrastructure we have available to us as Amazon, generally the monthly bill for that is going to come out over the long haul to be cheaper than having bought, let's say, 50 services. The other thing we like about Amazon is they don't hide any of the data from you. Now, I think we all might have our complaints, and I know CloudFront's come a long way in logging and activity thing, but it was never really hidden from you to kind of build your own logging or to get at the raw logger files. And what we find is with a lot of other services, you might be buying the service, but then you got to go pay a little bit more money to get the analytics or a little bit money to get the data. Those are the upsells. And I think with Amazon, the data is always there. We can always manipulate it. We can always build tools around it. And that's great because we want to keep that expertise in-house. AWS, I mean, I guess in our region, we're based in Singapore, but I think they're doing a great job in the Southeast Asia region in general of traveling around, bringing the experts around that work for Amazon to help people use Amazon better. And I know people have contacted us even just to help us lower our bills. So I think they do care about the success of the startup by helping you to be successful and to use the system wisely and to use it affordably. And I think that's important. And I'll just add as a bonus that there's beers now and then thrown in from the team, which is I think a great thing. So I think I'll conclude my time there. Obviously, it's a kind of a 50,000-foot level, but I hope it gives you a sense of you can take all these various services and kind of wire them together to build whatever you want. And I think for us, and that we're in streaming, we're able to do everything and actually stream the movies with CloudFront. And I think that's for us been a real innovation over the last couple of years, where you've normally been stuck talking to a very specific few set of CDN vendors to accomplish things, where now you can kind of build whatever you want on top of Amazon. All right.
Thank you very much for that, Smithy. More beers coming your way, definitely. That was really helpful and really excellent, so I appreciate you taking us through that. Very interesting, I think, in terms of the points you talked about, the ever-increasing scale of content and data and moving processes closer to the content as opposed to the other way around to try and simplify these things. As I mentioned before, we do have a survey at the end of this session as well, so again, please do fill that out. But what I was going to do now is perhaps go to some questions. Again, do feel free to send those in to us. We very much appreciate your feedback. So I'll kick off with a few questions now, that's okay. So I have a question really asking around how you actually validate the performance of a CDN, which I think is a very question that I hear a lot of times. And often people are just trying to ask how they actually do their job internally. If they're going to go and speak to the senior sort of decision makers in their company, either perhaps they have a CDN already, or they're thinking about whether or not it adds value to them. The process of going down that path is not easy. There's often different ways of testing a service, lots of metrics that can be used. So often I have this question, and I think that essentially what we try and start off with is, understanding the customer's business, understanding their traffic profile, what they're actually trying to send out and deliver to their customers, what the content types are. Because then it's very easy to start to define what we call success criteria. What looks like a good service to you? It's not just latency. There are things like availability. How much is going to affect your workflow? If it speeds everything up but it takes you twice as long, is that worth doing? And also costs. Can you work through examples of how much this may cost now, but also should your service start to scale? And then we can look at how you're actually going to measure these metrics. Are you going to use in-house tools or perhaps some of the third-party tools out there, like companies like Sodexis or Gomez or Keynotes? All these are valid options. But I think what's really important is to understand how they actually run their measurements. I've seen lots of organizations use things like backbone testing, which is basically looking at how performance works down to a data center, which obviously isn't very relevant because none of your customers actually live in data centers. So what we want to try and do is understand how we can measure what it's going to be like for your customer, for example, sat on a mobile phone, trying to access your application, your content. And the way you start to do that is look at the very least, last mile testing, where you're testing down to the last mile closest to where their end user is. Or perhaps even better than that is looking at real user metrics, where you're testing down to the screen. Now, obviously, there's nothing like actually having real users give you feedback, but using real user metrics is going to get you an experience like that. So that's going to give you an opportunity to feel what it's going to be like in terms of a proof of concept. So once you've defined these success criteria, define how you're going to measure them and what tools you're going to use, we can be on the same page and we can work through that to ensure that your testing is useful. But it's also important to think about timescale as well, right? There's no point doing it for a day or a few hours. You've got to think about how your users consume your service. So, a video service like Spool, for example, may have users accessing content at different times. So measuring over a logical time period, whether it's a week or longer, makes sense. So you've got a real an understanding of what it might look like. And I think the next step from them, obviously, is what we call production testing. And do reach out to us, whether it's video or whatever workload it is. We can help you do that. We have a free tier where you could start to use our services. And if you wanted to scale up that testing to a larger volume, reach out to us and we can work out a way of making that very, very cost effective for you. So there are multiple ways of doing this, and all this is just to ensure that we give you a true understanding of what performance will be like, and then you can feed that back into your own teams and your own decision makers to figure out what makes sense. Okay, so what do I do if I need a feature or service which you guys currently don't offer? I think the key there for us is obviously please do tell us. And I think all of the iterations, I think I touched upon it earlier, have been driven by what customers have asked us to do. But I think it's very important for us to understand why you need a feature. And the reason why I say that is obviously there's lots of different terminology in the marketplace, but there's often multiple ways of fixing a particular service. We get lots of innovation brought to us in terms of being a bit more agile and being a bit more intelligent how we do things. So Spool's a great example of that. They constantly come into us with ideas of how they solve issues, and it helps us to actually improve what we do. So if there is something that you'd like us to add to our service, whether that's a feature or indeed coverage globally, do tell us, help us understand why it's important to you, and we'll either suggest a way of solving that issue today, or we'll take that up to our product management team who's constantly reviewing these requests and look to try and see if we can roll that out. A good example is a recent POP we've launched in Melbourne, or some of the enhanced security features we've just released based on customer requirements. Okay, see if we can do one more. How do we compare CloudFront to other CDNs? I do get this question a lot, and I kind of understand why people are doing it. Essentially, it's we want to try and help you do your job. I think the main thing that we do as a business, AWS as a whole, but also CloudFront, we don't really focus on what other companies are doing. Sounds a little bit of a glib statement. It's not meant to be. What we're really saying is if we can understand what you want and why you need it, what we can do is suggest how we can help facilitate that through our services, or indeed through the partner network that Michael's mentioned beforehand. So all of this is driven by us understanding what you need and not necessarily matching what somebody else does in the marketplace, because quite frankly there might be a better way of doing it, either technically or indeed commercially. So we try and focus on our customer as opposed to what everyone else is doing. I'm just going to check if we have any more questions at all. Okay, please do. We don't currently have any at the moment, but please do feel to follow up in terms of the actual feedback, the actual survey itself, and obviously phone any questions. And I just want to highlight, it doesn't have to just be for Amazon as well. If you have questions for Michael at Spool, please do send them to us and we can facilitate that forwarding on. And again, unless we have any other questions, I just want to say thank you very much for your time. Okay, bye.